Hi, everyone.
Greetings. We're in the section of Genesis 47 where the family is settling in Goshen by the permission or even encouragement of Pharaoh. And something happens in the next section that I didn't really think about when I used to think about the story of Joseph. But this is very important in view of the overall purpose of the book of Genesis and the Torah, etc., in the Old Testament. It has something to do with the perception of the Jews that things never happen that are totally in one direction. There's always some kind of complication that you don't foresee at the time. As Jacob's story has already revealed about some of his plans and missteps, right? Now we have something that even Joseph perhaps cannot see the repercussions of. And that's in Genesis 47, starting at verse 11.
And Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread, according to the number of their families. Now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed."
And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year, and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There's nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's.
And as for the people, he moved them into the cities, from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end. Only the land of the priest he did not buy, for the priest had rations allotted to them. Allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their lands. I think you'll have to read.
All right, this is the ESV version. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So what would I have not noticed when I was a witness? Well, this deal looks like a very good deal for the Egyptians at this point. They're blessing Joseph and Pharaoh because they've saved the lives of their families.
Yeah.
And it looks like a good deal for Joseph and his family, too, because the fact that some power has now been removed from the landowners and therefore the aristocrats might work in the favor of Israel, because after all, they would feel somewhat threatened by being surrounded by Egyptians of another culture.
All of this is sort of a temporary help, for sure. It's a help. But the feel of it is only going to be temporary, the satisfaction.
Yeah.
Because as generations go by, they're going to feel, you could see this would sow seeds of resentment as to now we are slaves. Even if they're called servants here, they're slaves now to Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Because he owns all the land.
Yeah, and that is the way it always works, right? What seems to be an advantage at the time, or even for both parties might be an advantage, might also ultimately end up in hostility, because you realize a deal was made that will cost you something.
Yeah.
And here they have lost their ancestral lands, apparently, and now it's all belonging to Pharaoh except the priests, which sooner or later somebody's going to resent.
Yeah.
And then what happens when a less favorable Pharaoh is in control? Here, the benevolent Pharaoh, everything looks good because he, of course, favors Joseph and his family. But what happens when a less than favorable Pharaoh arises?
Then he can
or
maybe
the people
pass the buck
Yeah.
and make it sound like it's Joseph's fault
Yeah.
that this has all happened. So, but in the very end, it all plays out to the providence of God, really, because it gets them out of the land because things turn worse. But it's all kind of, it seems to all work out to them being pushed out of the land.
Yes,
This
even
whole
their
thing.
slavery in another era, hundreds of years later, even their slavery turns out to be necessary to their calling out to the Lord and leaving the land. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's another aspect of this that I really didn't think about it when I was a witness, namely that what Joseph is arranging here is actually against the law of Moses.
Yeah.
Because the law of Moses makes provision not just for the national interest, not just for the guys at the top to be in power over all the land, not even for the tribes. The law of Moses makes provision for every family to have its own
Which, of course,
inheritance.
this is all happening before the law of Moses
Yes.
even exists. But you see that the principles laid out here are contrary to what you would see in the Mosaic law.
Yeah.
Whereas they all the ownership of the land is different. It's not the king's land.
No.
So even when Israel establishes
The kingship.
the king doesn't own all the land. God owns all the land. And he gives as an inheritance each family a piece of land. And that can't be taken away from them. So it's very different.
Yeah.
The people would not feel the same sense of burden now. They could sell land temporarily, but it goes back to them.
The
So
Jubilee arrangement.
Yeah, the whole Mosaic law deals with these temporary needs in a different way.
Yeah. And you remember the story of Naboth and his vineyard and what Ahab went through, his sulking, and how his wife Jezebel got him past his sulking. But because he didn't have the power to take the land of a man who was just an ordinary man, a fairly wealthy fellow Jew who had a vineyard next door to his palace, apparently, or next door to some of his land.
And having a foreign wife, she just thinks you're the king, you can do what you want.
Well, that's what pagan kings do, isn't it?
Yeah.
Arbitrary kingship. But not in Israel. The king is to serve. And that's obviously the case in many cases in the Old Testament. But here, not in Egypt, but Joseph brings a situation around where the king's will is potentially tyrannical.
Yeah.
There's some good comments on this. In our notes, we've got comments from Barnhouse, Campbell Morgan, and Franz Delitzsch. This is what Barnhouse says. All the Egyptians became crown tenants of Pharaoh, and a sort of feudal system was instituted. Critics have accused Joseph of making a nation of slaves, but the Egyptians were not slaves. They were free tenants who paid a 20% income tax. That was not heavy, in the light of history. Sayce, that's the archaeologist A.H. Sayce, says the power of the old aristocracy was broken as completely as it had been in Japan, has been in Japan in our day. Now here's an American preacher, interestingly, defending what amounts to a defiance of the law of Moses, or the principles of the law of Moses.
Well, I think this kind of thinking, now that people are in a period of great struggle when it comes to money and land and ownership, people can't afford to buy a house, can't afford to rent a house, that I think we see that even if you have a job, even if you have a mortgage, you can trick yourself into thinking you own something, but really the bank owns it, and you are a slave. You're a slave to make those payments, and there's always risk of you losing it.
Well, I do think, though, we North Americans, like Barnhouse, tend to reason this way, that this is our right.
Freedom, yeah.
Some kind of freedom. Freedom to pay rent.
Yeah.
Well,
just
that's
who
not
do you pay it
not
to?
God's design.
Yeah.
Now you have an English preacher, Campbell Morgan, right next to this. What does he have to say about these same events?
By the centralization of authority in one head, he precluded the possibility of the harassment of the Hebrew people by the Egyptians, and the rivalries of petty princes. Of course, it is equally true that by this very action he made possible what subsequently happened, the enslaving of the whole people by the will of the supreme Pharaoh. Thus again, the hand of God was seen operating through Egyptian policy for the immediate safety of his people, and ultimately for the long discipline of slavery and suffering through which they were to pass.
So I tend to agree more with Morgan, that
Me
you've
too.
got to see the big picture here, that it does work to their temporary advantage, but permanently, providentially, yes, to get them out of Egypt. But did it work to the Egyptians' advantage? That's kind of left dangling here, isn't it? Franz Delitzsch has this to say: the history of Joseph is so far the opening of the history of Israel, and a type of the path of the church, and the church's head, from humiliation to exaltation, from bondage to freedom, from suffering to glory. The treatment he received from his brethren turned by the message of God to their safety, and that of the nation descending from them. And this is a type of the treatment Christ received from his people, which the counsel of God turned to the world's salvation, and will at last turn to the salvation of Israel. So Franz Delitzsch, by the way, a Jewish Christian, sees very clearly the typology here, that all of this is somehow foreshadowing what will happen with Christ and his relationship to Israel. Yeah.
Very good.
We've got a link, right? It's
To a video we did on Naboth and Ahab.
Naboth and Ahab. Naboth, rather, and Ahab. And it's about the protection in the law. I think we told it something like the cap on capital.
Family inheritance.
It's a
Okay.
cap on capitalism and a cap on kingly power, right?
That's right.
Yeah. See you next time.
Bye.